Okay, so today we're diving into pre-World War II Japan with a leader who's, well, he's a bit of a puzzle.
Yeah, Fumimaro Konoe, prime minister 3 times in those incredibly tense years leading up to the war.
3 times. Imagine that pressure. And he's making decisions that have, well, global consequences, especially in how Japan ends up on a collision course with the U.S.
And that's exactly what makes this deep dive so interesting, right? Because it's easy to look back and think, oh, war with America, that was inevitable. But then you dig into these articles from Toyo Kizai and Asahi Shimbun.
And you see Konoe trying to navigate this incredibly complex situation, trying to appease the military at home, while also, I don't know, it's almost like he doesn't believe the U.S. will really push back against Japan's expansion.
There's this assumption that everyone in Japan was just itching for a fight, but Konoe's story, it just doesn't fit that simple narrative.
No, not at all. So let's jump into it. 1937, the Marco Polo Bridge incident, Japanese and Chinese forces clash, and Konoe, even though he'd rather avoid a bigger conflict, well, things escalate.
And that's where his strong hand strategy comes in, which honestly sounds way more effective as a slogan than it turned out to be.
Right. Like, strong hand, it sounds so decisive, but what was he really going for with that?
The Toyo Kizai piece suggests Konoe thought that by taking a hard line, he could satisfy the military, who were gaining more and more influence, by the way.
Oh, they were a force to be reckoned with, weren't they?
Absolutely. So Konoe's thinking maybe he throws them a bone, shows some muscle, then he can ease back, regain control. Problem is, it doesn't really work out that way, does it?
Oh, it spirals pretty quickly. The article suggests that Konoe, he really misjudged things, especially with China.
He seemed to think that China would just back down in the face of Japanese military might.
Big miscalculation. And unfortunately for Konoe, and frankly the entire world, those miscalculations, they kept adding up.
It's like a domino effect, one mistake setting off another.
Because fast forward a few years, 1941, Japan moves into southern French Indochina, and the U.S. responds by freezing Japanese assets. Tensions are at a boiling point.
And Konoe, according to Asahi Shimbun, he's pinning his hopes on a summit with President Roosevelt, almost like a last-ditch effort to avoid full-blown war.
But as we know, that meeting never happens, which really makes you wonder, what if? What if they had talked on it? Could it have changed everything?
It's one of those huge what-ifs of history, right? Because you also have to factor in what's happening in Europe at the same time. Hitler's just invaded the Soviet Union, and at first, Japan sees that as an opportunity.
They'd always seen the Soviet Union as a threat, so Germany's invasion, for a while there, it actually makes Japan more open to war themselves.
Right, because they're thinking, hey, maybe we can grab some territory while they're distracted, but then the U.S. starts sending aid to the Soviets, and right before Pearl Harbor, bam, the Soviets launch this massive counteroffensive. The whole game changes in an instant.
It really makes you think, would Konoe have recognized how much that shifted things? How much leverage the U.S. suddenly had? It's impossible to know for sure, of course.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle where half the pieces are missing. But here's where Konoe's story gets really interesting, because this guy, who's been so central to Japan's path towards war, once the fighting actually starts, he seems to have a complete change of heart.
Yeah, and change of heart might be putting it mildly, because Asahi Shimbun, they highlight this quote from Konoe, supposedly said on the very day of the Pearl Harbor attack. He says, "This war is lost. Your job is to study how we will lose." Let me just repeat that for a second.
Yeah.
This war is lost. On the day of the attack, coming from the guy who was just running the country, that's a bombshell.
Right. It's like he's admitting defeat before most people even know the fight has begun.
Yeah.
And it really makes you question what led him to that conclusion. What did he see that others didn't? Or maybe what did he finally allow himself to see, you know?
Talk about a reality check. I mean, can you imagine to be so involved in the lead up to war, to be in that position of power, and then on the very day it all explodes?
To have that clarity, or maybe that despair, who knows?
He goes from architect of war to, what? Prophet of defeat. It's incredible, but it doesn't end there, right? Konoe actually starts working to end the war, even as it's raging on.
Behind the scenes, he's reaching out, trying to find a way out for Japan.
Which eventually he plays a key role in. Japan's surrender, the drafting of their new constitution after the war, even meeting with General MacArthur. It's unbelievable when you think about where he started.
Talk about a transformation, but, and this is the tragedy of Konoe, public opinion, it turns on him.
Yeah, even after all that, he ends up on the list of Class A war criminals. Which, just to clarify for our listeners, that's the most serious category. The ones who are held responsible for planning and starting the war.
The ones who carry the burden of guilt, even if they spend their final years trying to make things right. And for Konoe, that burden, it proved too much. He takes his own life before he can be arrested.
It's a tragic ending to a life marked by such dramatic contradictions. I mean, here we have this figure, Konoe, who makes huge miscalculations, contributes to this devastating global conflict, and yet spends his final years striving for peace.
Almost like he's trying to atone for the past. And it makes you think, right, about leadership, about accountability.
About the long shadow of war and how even when it seems like things couldn't get any worse, there are still choices to be made.
Choices that matter, even if they can't erase the past.
It makes you wonder, when he saw what that war became, the sheer scale of it, did he have regrets?
It's impossible to know, really. But thinking about Konoe, it always brings me back to the importance of dissent, of questioning assumptions, especially when the stakes are high.
You need those voices in the room pushing back, even when, no, especially when it's uncomfortable.
Absolutely. It's easy to get swept up in the narrative, to think there's only one right way forward. But history teaches us, again and again,
That there were always different perspectives, different ways of looking at a problem.
And Konoe's story, as tragic as it is, it reminds us that those different perspectives, those dissenting voices, they can be the difference between peace and catastrophe.
Between repeating the mistakes of the past and actually learning from them. Which, that's kind of the whole point of these deep dives, isn't it?
It is. We dig into these historical events, these decisions made by people who, let's be honest, were dealing with pressures and complexities we can barely imagine.
And we try to draw out those lessons, those insights that can help us navigate the world today.
Because the challenges might be different now, but the core issues, the human element, that hasn't changed. We're still grappling with conflict, with diplomacy, with trying to understand perspectives that are vastly different from our own.
And doing all of that in a world that seems to get more complicated by the day, right?
Yeah.
The speed of information now, the interconnectedness of everything.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
It is. But that's also why it's more important than ever to engage with history, to learn from those who came before us, even maybe especially when their choices were flawed, even disastrous.
So where does that leave us? What can we actually deal with all of this?
I think Konoe's story offers us at least a few guideposts. First, cultivate healthy skepticism. Don't just accept the prevailing narrative, especially when it comes to something as weighty as war. Question those assumptions, even especially when they come from people in positions of power.
Think for yourself. Do your own research.
Exactly. And second, never underestimate the value of diverse perspectives. Read widely, engage with people who see the world differently than you do, and really try to understand the full context of a situation before rushing to judgment.
Because the more we understand, the better equipped we are to find solutions to bridge those divides, to build a future that's more peaceful, more just, more sustainable. That's what we can learn from Konoe's story, from his successes and his failures.
From the tragedy of his end and from that glimmer of hope, that commitment to peace that marked his final years. That's the legacy we should all strive to carry forward.
It's a heavy legacy, no doubt, but it's a necessary one. And on that note, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the life and times of Fumimaro Konoe. Until next time.